Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin. We are Tanya Lesson number 4, chapter 2. Tanya chapter 2. You can share with me, Barry. Are you getting it online?
Yeah.
You can get it online. So we actually began chapter 2 last week. So we'll go over just a quick review of what we've done so far. In the first chapter, we learned that there is actually a new way to define human beings. A new way to define individuals. A tzaddik doesn't necessarily mean a tzaddik the way we thought it means. A rasha doesn't mean a rasha the way we thought it means. And a beinoni doesn't mean just an in-between kind of guy. Rather, there has to be more meaning to what each of these individuals are. So we began by saying that every single person, every single Jew has two souls. And we went at length talking about the first soul. We explained that everything that happens in his physical life, the negative traits as well as some of the good traits, all come from the soul. And then we began talking about the second soul, the nefesh hashenis, the second soul. We said the nefesh hashenis, the second soul, hi chelek elikami mal mamish, is a part of God above. Actually, this word chelek elikami mal, a part of God, actually comes from Job, where Job was complaining to God and saying, God, why did you put this part of God from above down here? And so the Alter Rebbe is adapting that and saying that the nefesh, and we explained the idea of nefesh, that's the lowest level of the soul, the level of the soul that actually encloses itself into the physical body, and everything from the body is affected by it, as opposed to the higher levels of the soul, the ruach, neshama. We're saying that the nefesh actually affects you and your body. And what happens here is, we say it's a chelik elikami mal, it's a part of God from above, and then he adds the word mamish. Mamish means in actuality. Like it surely is. It's not really a translation in English for it, but saying it definitely is. Mamish, it's like it's the true essence of what it is. And then we explained the difference that everything in the world, what is the difference between this soul and everything else? So we said everything in the world is created with dibur, with God's speech. But over here, it's done through breath. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. And God breathed into Adam the living soul. So Adam actually had within him this life, which was the essence, the inside, the internal part of God, as opposed to speech, which is external. When it comes to breathing, breathing is something from the inside. Someone that breathes from the inside. So in other words, we're saying that this soul, this nefesh hashenis, the second soul, is a part of God from the internal, essential being of Hashem. And this is what the second soul is all about. You don't want to know who that is. That's the media. All right. And so now we're going to start from, so too allegorically speaking, the Jewish souls have risen in divine thought. In the old book, it's on page 48 in the middle.
Page 50.
Page 50 in the new book. So, Step number one, we know that this soul called the nefesh is a chelek elokah mimal. It's a part of God, and we said it's from the internal part, just like someone breathing, as opposed to someone that is speaking, which is very external. The breath comes from the inside. That's why people lose breath much quicker, because it affects you much more. And I know some people who can talk for hours and hours and not be affected. But, so that's speech. So most things in this world are created with speech, but this soul, this Jewish soul, is from the inside. Now, another point. So too, allegorically speaking, have Jewish souls risen in divine thought. Alu b'machshava. They've risen, b'machshava, with divine thought. As opposed to speech, which is, again, an external way of expression. Your machshava, your thought, is very internal. Just like a person can't really speak out the true depth of what a person is really feeling or thinking. So you can say a little bit, you can try and express it in different ways, but your true identity is really expressed in the way you think. The way you think, that's really who you are. I am because I think. That's why you find sometimes that a person may be very overcome with thought or emotion, and they'll try and explain it in different ways. But ultimately, as much as you're going to explain it, it's not really the true essence of what is being affected in your life. You find someone that has a very special simcha. A child gets married, and you see that person is so happy they can't even speak, they can't say anything. How are you feeling now? Amazing, great, incredible. Can you describe your emotions? No, you can't describe it. There are things that are really internal that you can't describe. So when you talk about thought is much more vast than anything that can ever be described with speech. And so when we talk about the world, we said the world is created with asar mamaris, with the 10 utterances. God uttered the creation. Let there be light, let there be water, let there be fish, let there be animals, and so on. All these things are created only with God's speech, but not really with God's intellect. In other words, what is really God thinking, so to speak? Obviously, as we're going to see, you can't really describe God's thought. But what is really God thinking? In other words, what is really the internal desire of God? That can't really be expressed. But, that all being said, the nefesh, the Jewish soul, is connected to Hashem's intellect. So this Jewish soul comes down, this neshama, this nefesh comes down, and it's essentially coming from God's machshava, from God's thought, from God's intellect. Where do we see this? Let's continue on reading. As it is written regarding the Jewish nation, B'ni b'chayir Yisrael, Israel is my firstborn son. And it also says, you are the children unto God your Lord. What are we learning from the fact of a child? Why does this show anything? So he explains that this is to say, the significance of the Jew being called God's child is that just as a child is derived from his father's brain, an inner and essential being, so too, to use anthropomorphism of the soul of every Jew derived from God's thought and wisdom. So just like a child essentially comes from, in its source, we're soon going to see how it plays out, but in its source, that child comes from the wisdom or the brain, the mind of the father. So too, the people of Israel are called the children of God. It means that they originate in God's mind, in God's brain. Now, that being said, what does it mean God's mind? What does it mean God's brain? How can you say God's wisdom? What exactly does that mean? What does it mean, God's wisdom? God has wisdom, but speech is two different things. So we have to say, okay, when we're talking about God's wisdom, don't be confused and say, yes, it's the type of wisdom that we could relate to. No, it's not a wisdom that we could relate to. And we have a quote here from the Rambam, from Maimonides. It says, for he is wise, but not with wisdom that is known to us created beings, because he and his wisdom are one. And as Maimonides writes, he is knowledge and simultaneously the knower. In other words, when you think about something, the way we know of thought, so when we want to contemplate an idea, so the fact is that there are three different parts to this thought. There is our mind that is thinking the thought. There is the one that is thinking the thought, and then there is the thought that you're thinking about. The concept that you're thinking about is different than the mind that's thinking it and the person that's using his mind to think about that. It's three different parts, all connecting to one thing, but that's essentially three different parts of this thought. If I want to study something, so if I want to, let's talk about Einstein, the theory of relativity. So he has to think about something of relativity that's outside of his brain, his mind. And his mind has to try and grasp something that's external. It's essentially a different thing than himself. And he's trying to grasp it and understand it. So you have the one that's thinking about it, the intellectual, the intellect, and the mind that's actually thinking. In other words, the intellectual that's using his intellect to think about the concept. They're three different things. But God, it's all the same. So you see, in our world, we only know of things. We don't know of a existence that is not made up of different identities. In our world, we can only identify something by what is it. Has parameters. Has to have its time, has to have its place, has to have its make, its color, its design. Everything is made up of something. In God's world, in the spiritual realm as a whole, not everything has a specific definition. Now, in the spiritual world, there's different types of definitions of how you define something. But regardless, nothing has to be specifically defined. You don't need to think. So we can't really grasp this concept of the knower and the idea to be one. We can't really grasp that concept. Because in our world, everything is separated by its parameters. And so anything that's going to happen is, or anything that you're going to think about is always going to be something external of yourself. But by God, that's not the case. By God, it's all one. Let me just finish this thing. Let's continue on reading. Maimonides concludes over there, and this is not within the power of any man to comprehend clearly. It is written, can you find and understand God by searching? It is also written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. But what do we get from here? What we get from here is that we say that the nefesh, going back to the point, the nefesh comes from God's machshava, from Hashem's machshava, from Hashem's thought, from Hashem's divine thought. Now we can't really understand what that means, divine thought. Nevertheless, because divine thought means that it's the true being of everything, the thought and the thinker. So if you're saying divine thought, it's not something separate from God. That is God himself. God's thought and the concept are really one. The thinker, the idea, and the mind are all one. So when we say children of God, which means children who come from the mind of the Father. So it's not that it's a separate entity, the mind of the Father, but the mind and the Father is one. So when we want to say that we are connected to God, that this nefesh, this soul we're saying comes from God, and that it's actually a part of God, it's actually a part of God. The fact that it originates in God's thought means that it's part of the essence of God. And so we have 3 points here. Point number 1 is that God blew in, nafachtabi, which means it's a part of his internal essential being, unlike speech. Number 2, the idea is that it comes from thought, machshava in Hebrew, machshava. Again, as we pointed out numerous times, we're learning a new vocabulary. Okay, so we have now nefesh. This nefesh is a part of God, mimal mamish, an actual part of God. Now we know that it originates from blowing. It comes from machshava, from thought. And we compare this to a child. And the Torah defines this concept by comparing the people of Israel to being God's children, banim atam Hashem, God's children. And this idea of the children means that they come from God's thought, which means that they are essentially part of God because it's God, his thought, and him is one. So when we say God's thought, it doesn't mean that the thought is an external part, like the way we know thought to be. You have the person and the thought, 2 separate things. No, it's God, the thought, he, him, and the idea are all one. He, the thought, and the idea are all one. And so when we say children, it means it comes from the mind of Hashem, which means that it's essentially part of God. So what we have here is that this nefesh is really a part of God, and it's a part of God, mamish, an actual part of God. Yes, you had a question.
I did. I don't know if it applies now.
The question was answered?
Well, kind of. I was just trying to see how we, as human beings, in terms of chachma, is that similar to our chachma? Because that is above, and that's the idea, the quote idea. I mean, it's more than that, so that's why it doesn't jive.
We're going to get into that in chapter 3. Okay, the way our concept of chachma, we're going to talk about that more in chapter 3. Now, the only reason we're bringing this now is to bring out the idea of this godly soul, this part of God.
Just one question. Nefesh is in the blood. It's part of the blood.
Yeah. Nefesh is the base of the soul, which encloses itself within the lower realms. Now there's a note which is a little bit complex and a little bit Kabbalistic. So I think we're going to get back to this in a little bit after we explain some of these concepts later. But what he's basically asking in the note isn't saying that God has wisdom that's one with him, isn't that actually limiting God to a certain extent? Even so, like you say God has wisdom. The fact that you're saying God has wisdom, even though you're saying it's not a wisdom of human being, it's a wisdom where the knowledge and knower and the concept are all one, but still that's limiting God. And so he answers one word, but to say it in one word, it's very, very important, is you always have to know the context. Everything's within context. And the context of God within the realm of what the Rambam Maimonides was talking about. This was a book, Rambam wrote this in his book of halacha, his book of law, not his book of Kabbalah. Rambam wrote a book which is more Kabbalistic based, known as the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. That's more Kabbalistic based. This was written in the book of Halacha, the book of laws, where the Rambam wanted to point this out within the context of what he's talking about, of what a human being can relate to a certain extent. But yes, of course, God is much higher than that in higher realms. We'll get back to this in a little bit, because when we talk later on, talking about the different worlds, this will help us this will help us understand this concept more. But now we're going to ask a question. Now there's a simple question. So we're saying that everyone has this soul, that every Jew, no matter who you are, has this soul, this godly soul. Never get so many calls at one time. So now we're saying that every Jew comes from this godly soul, and every Jew is actually part of God. So that raises a question. What's the question?
How come we're all different?
How come we're all different? Right? You read ahead, didn't you? How come we're all different? How can you have many different types of people, many different levels? Throughout the generations, you have different people, you have different generations. You have, within each and every generation, you have some people that are greater people, tzaddikim, holy people, some people that are more simple. How can you have the concept of sin? How can you have people who don't follow the ways of Hashem? How can you have people who are sinners? If their very definition is God Himself coming down into this world, an actual part of God coming into this world, how could there be so many different levels if we all come from the same source? Right? Is that a question?
All of us, we have some God in us because we are alive. God is love.
Because what?
God is love.
Is love?
Life.
Life? Yes, we're talking about the second nefesh. You're talking about the first nefesh.
The knowledge that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't cut it. We are the whole thing.
So the question over here is, how can there be many different levels? How can there be many different types if essentially we're all coming from the same place? And you want to say something?
No, I better not.
Well, say
I was
it.
just thinking, well, sometimes you take a deep breath, sometimes you take a shallow breath, and it depends on what he's blowing at the time.
But it's all coming from the same person essentially. If we're giving the example of everyone coming from God's mind, whatever that means, God's thought, so it's all the same thought
All
essentially.
at the same time, all in one thought or one.
Well, it's all from the same source. You could also ask a more important question, which is, okay, so if we are a part of God down here, then how can we even identify as ourselves? How can you even identify as a self being if you have this God makeup within you? Why are you not completely lost within that?
Each of us came from all of us.
Yeah.
Creation, but each of us, we are a unique universe.
Okay.
Is it up to us as individuals?
Huh?
Is it up to us as individuals, because of free will, that we choose what we choose and what we don't choose?
Well, over here we're talking about identity,
Okay.
right? We're talking about identity. If your identity is a part of God, and we say you're actually a part of God, so number one, how could there be many different levels, and how could you yourself be different levels within souls itself? We said there's different levels of the soul. How can you have different levels of the soul? We said there's a level of the nefesh, or the ruach, the neshama. if everything essentially comes with the same source? Yes.
God has partners in creation.
Sort of. Okay.
But when they say there's three entities in the room, right?
Right. So sort of. So that's what we're going to get to. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to give a simple parable to explain this. And he said that we just said that we said the concept of a son coming from the father. And that's the idea of coming from the thought. Right? Every child begins within the thought of the father. So he says that now what happens? It's true that you start off with that source, but then that thought which begins by the father, and that goes to, it becomes a drop, which is then transferred to the female, to the woman, to the mother. And then that little drop that originated by the father then develops. And you have 9 months of development. And what happens? You have from this little drop from the father, this now develops into being a full-blown child. And within this child, there's many different elements. You have hands, feet, mind, heart, all coming from the same source. How can that be? The answer is that the mother is nourishing this child for 9 months and helps it develop. And over this time, this child now develops into many different parts, many different levels, even though it comes from the very same source.
So basically, it's an inner environment that makes each person different.
So it's the development into a being that actually changed that. You could see even you could have parents who have the same exact parents, yet two different children who are totally different characteristics. You could even have you could even have twins that are opposites. Right? Even biblically, we have Yaakov and Esau. Same parents, twins, and polar opposites. How could that be? They're coming from the exact same place. And the answer is that yes, it originates from the father's mind, the father's thought. However, then, once it develops by the mother during those 9 months, so it could develop differently. And then we're going to explain the same thing is with the souls. Let's read inside. We're at the bottom of page 52 in the old book, 55 in the new one. True, there are myriads of different 54. Different gradations of the soul, neshamot, rank upon rank, ad infinitum. For example, the souls of the patriarchs and of Moses, our teacher, are by far superior to the souls of our own generations, which belongs to the period preceding the coming of Mashiach, which is the time that we find ourselves now. The heels of Mashiach, the footsteps of Mashiach. Furthermore, for the latter souls, like the times of footsteps of Mashiach, are like the very soles of the feet. Soles is way spelled differently, S-O-L-E-S, of the feet, in comparison to the brain and the head. So if you compare our generation to generation that left Egypt, where they had open miracles, they literally got manna from heaven, they saw the sea splitting before them, they were very high souls. In our generation, we're not on that level. We don't see God openly. And yet, we are at the heels of Mashiach. We are the last generation, the generation that's going to see Mashiach, and yet at the same time, spiritually, the lowest generation. We have the least recognition of godliness that any generation has seen. There's no temple. There's no revelation of God in any way. So that's number one with regards to generations as a whole. Furthermore, similarly, within each generation, we find the same disparity among neshama. There are those who are the heads of the leaders of the multitude of Israel, so designated because their souls are in the category of head and brain in comparison with those of the masses and the ignorant. In every generation, you have many different levels. You have the heads and the more simple ones. Haman ve'amaretz, the masses and the Amiras translated as ignorant, literally the people of the earth. Furthermore, within every individual there are different levels. And similar distinctions between nefashot and nefashot, the levels of the soul nefesh. For every soul consists of nefesh, ruach, and neshama, as we said earlier. It doesn't mention chay yachida because those affect everyone the same way, pretty much, because they're not enclosed within the body as the nefesh, ruach, and neshama are. So he's comparing it, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, those which actually affect the body in different ways. The nefesh, the life force of the body, the ruach, the spirit, and the neshama, the conceptual part of the neshama, but still, you have different parts. And yet we're saying that it all comes from the same place. Furthermore, I think I skipped the page. Nevertheless, the root of every nefesh, ruach, and neshama, from the highest of all ranks to the lowest being those souls embodied within the illiterate and the most light-minded of light-minded Jews, are all derived, as it were, from the supreme mind, which is chachma ilah, means the supernal wisdom. So how could that be? And so the answer, as we said, we're going to first bring the parable, and then we'll explain how this plays out in the spiritual realm. The physical explanation we could understand, most of us could get it. It's pretty simple. The manner of the soul's descent is analogous to a child who is derived from the father's brain. Even the nails of the feet come into existence from the very same drop of semen which comes from the father's brain. How then were nails created from it? Right? A nail is the lowest part. You can cut off a nail and you won't even feel it. And you're comparing that to a brain, to a heart, which is the life force, the pumping energy of the body, the intellect. Yet it comes from the same place. By being in the mother's womb for 9 months, descending degree by degree, changing continually, until even the nails are formed from it. Furthermore, although the drop has been altered to become the substance of the child's nails, yet it is still bound to and united in a wondrous and mighty unity with the original essence and being, namely the drop of semen that came from the father's brain. And this is a very important part. That even though everything changed and there's many different levels within the body, there's many different parts of the body, the body has a vast makeup, nevertheless, it's still all connected to that one original place. It all comes from the same place. You can't say that it comes from different places, and you can't say different children from the same parent comes from different places. It all comes from the same place.
Excuse me, Rabbi. Therefore, each part is important. Like each Jews.
Yes, let's let it play out a little bit, okay? And now's another point. Now's another point, which is also very significant. That even now, in the Son, the nails receive their nourishment and life from the brain that is in his head. This is a very important part as well. That now, the nourishment that comes from even the very small parts of that body also come from the brain itself. Now, why is this important? Because the child's brain is that which really is connected to the father. Because originally it came from the father's what?
Brain.
Father's brain, the father's mind. Father's brain is where it originated. Then it developed, and part of the development of that child is the brain. That's the main source of the life of the body, that brain. and the brain controls everything that happens in the body. So now you have these two minds that are essentially connected, the Father and the Son. That's why many times they think alike, many times they'll act alike. If you want to see an image of yourself, you have to look at your children. If you want to see how you should not have acted, sometimes you have to look at your children. Or if you want to see what gave your father and mother white hairs, you look at your children. So this is the development of the child. So we have a few points. Number one, the child comes from the brain of the father. Number two, it develops for many months in the womb of the mother until it has many different parts and aspects that's created within the child. Even once that child is born, everything still gets the source from the brain. Now, one more point. As it is written in Gemara and Nida, from the white of the father's drop of semen are formed the veins, the bones, and the nails of the child. This is brought down from the Talmud and Nida, which basically points out that that's why you have certain parts of the body that stay white, and part of that is actually the bones, not the bones, the bones, the nails, and the veins all stay white because of its original source. And furthermore, we say in Eitz Chaim Shar HaChashmal is likewise stated in connection with the esoteric principle of Adam's garments in the Garden of Eden, that the garments, were of nails derived from the cognitive faculty of the brain. As we all know, that Adam originally did not wear clothing. Adam originally was naked, and he lived just like any creature. Why? Because there was no concept of evil then, so there was nothing to cover up, nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be embarrassed of, until the sin of the tree. And so what was his garment that clothed him? The garment that clothed him were these nails, which again comes from where? Comes from the brain. And that's why we find that it's similar color and a similar development in many different ways. And so that came from the mind, from the moach tevuna, from the faculty of the brain, and this was what protected him. Now, when we talk about a garment helps the individual to, number one, it covers up, but it also helps you express yourself in different ways. A garment, depending on what you wear, says where you are. You're not going to wear the same thing at work that you're going to wear to the beach or to shul.
It's also the nails are also a shell.
The nails are a shell. Right, so it covers up, but it's also a way of expression, is the point. And so Adam, before Gan Eden, this is what his garment was. The nails were his garment.
What are the role of a person's genes?
What do you mean by genes?
Chromosomes, your
Yeah.
fingerprint, what scientists look at.
Well, I mean, I understand the wording of genes, but I'm not exactly, what I'm asking is what exactly are you asking?
Well, you have brown hair, you have brown eyes.
Right.
I have blue eyes, I have brown hair, or used to have it.
Right.
But point of the matter is, genes play a role also, correct? I mean,
Right.
in the physicality.
So obviously,
What's the difference, but between a father's brain and the person's genes, is the father's brain giving the genes to the child, or?
yeah, everything comes from there.
That's really good.
But we
At the end of the chapter, we're gonna take a little bit of a turn at the end of the chapter. Maybe that will help out with your idea that you're asking. I don't know, but as of now, yes. I mean, everything here is the point is that everything that's the makeup of the child originates in the father and develops in the mother. Okay?
But as it's developing within the mother, it
Differentiate.
that's where the differences,
Absolutely.
that's where the differences come from. So the main body comes from father, the main thought comes from the father, but whatever for this 9 months that the mother has within her and the development, that has to be part of what the genes are and part of what.
Right, yes. Everything comes from there. But
Right.
so what we're taking out of here, this is not meant to be a biology class. The point over here is that we have to know that everything originates in the father. We're within the father's brain. Then that is given over to the mother. The mother then develops that child, and then the child could change very different. Now let's talk about how this plays out in the spiritual realm. So-
Excuse me. When we talk about the brains, is, as I say, everything is important. So when we say about the brains, is because we want to get at the level of the mind, of God's power is nothing like is more important than my kidneys
Well,
or
the-
my liver.
Well,
That is how I'm.
no, the brain. No, the idea is yes that the brain is higher, and that's how we're going to play this out. The whole point is that the brain is higher than the rest of the body.
Well, because the brain also, if you're doing biology, the brain also does whatever it's going to do within all of those other organs.
Right.
It's
The brain controls the body is the point. Everything that happens within the mind. That's why, if you know, we call Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, we call it Rosh Hashanah, the head of the body, as opposed to Tchilas Hashanah, the beginning of the year, or the New Year. We don't call it. It's translated as New Year, but it's not. It's really called the head of the year. What's the idea? The head of the year. That Rosh Hashanah, everything that happens in the year is dependent on what we do at Rosh Hashanah. The way we pray Rosh Hashanah, the way we act Rosh Hashanah. This is why we want to do things that should only be in a sweet way, that it should affect our year, because it's not only a new year, let's celebrate a new year, but actually whatever happens on Rosh Hashanah, that is how the year is going to go. So so it plays out in time as well, this concept. So now let us look at what how this is referenced within, how this concept is plays out within God and the souls. So in the analogy we said that the child comes from the father and then develops by the mother. So now what does it mean, a father, a mother? Can you say that by God? Father, mother, what exactly does that mean? So we have to understand this, before we do anything, we need a little bit of a preference, of an introduction. The introduction is as follows. There are a number of different worlds, and anybody who's been to our Kabbalah class, we've talked about this, and some of you have been, most of you have been. There are a number of different worlds, and each of these worlds is a way that God is able to conceal himself and be revealed in another level. When we talk about concealment, you need to, being that God is essentially the complete existence of everything, but at the same time, if we were to see God in his full being, then we would not be able to exist. If you want to have an external identity aside for God, so the only way that could be is with a concept called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum, anybody who was by my last course, What Is? We talked about tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is where God has to literally conceal his very essence and only reveal a small part of it. It's called tzimtzum. Add that to your vocabulary list, tzimtzum. What does it mean? The best example of this would be the idea of speech, which essentially is what the creation of the world is, speech. What does that mean? It means that you are taking everything that you know and everything that you feel and everything that you are made up of within yourself, and you are going to reveal it now within a few words. Even though I know so much more and I feel so much more, how am I going to right now identify my thought within those few words that I'm going to say? The same thing God says. God is the existence of everything. But how am I going to express myself at this point with those words? So first God expresses himself saying, let there be light. Then he expresses himself by saying, let there be water. Now, that's step number one, the idea of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means concealment and allowing just a small part to be revealed. Tzimtzum means God's concealing himself. That's step number one. That's introduction number one. Introduction number two. Once you have tzimtzum, it's still not enough to actually create the world. Because still, God is still revealing himself, but how can you have creations that feel as if they are an independent creature, an independent being? So for this, in order to do so, God created a process which is called the Seder Hishtalshalut, the chain order of creation. And in this process, he broke down level by level, or the way it's referred to is as worlds, broke down into different worlds, each world revealing God a little bit less, until the world that we live in, where God is almost not revealed at all. So it's like as if you want to charge your phone. So where does it come from? It has to come from a power plant. This is a very simple physical analogy. You have to charge your phone from a power plant. Now, I would highly not suggest that you try plugging your phone into a power plant. That would not really work well. What do? That power plant has to break down into different local, what are they called? What's the word for the local?
Utility.
There's a word for it. The powers. There's the transformers.
Step down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can have separate.
Right, and then
one big one, and then you have
right. So you have a big one in every city that you get from that power, and then you have every local neighborhood has their own transformers, and then you have wires that take it to each house, and then within each house you have to have the wiring that takes it to each outlet, and then thereby allowing yourself to charge your phone. So now, in a certain sense, it's a very, very simple physical example for this. So God also has to break it down from world to world. So the first world is called Atzilos. The world Atzilos, literally translated in here, is the world of emanation. But the translation of the word Atzilos comes from the word Eitzel. Eitzel means close to. A world that's very close to Hashem. Atzilos is the first level of concealment, but it's still very much a revelation of Hashem. In other words, Hashem is completely revealed in that realm. It's just the first idea of creation. Then the second world is called Beriah, which is translated as the world of creation. And this is when the first concept of created beings come about. Sometimes define the difference between Atzilus and Bria in an open fire as opposed to a coal, a burning coal. A burning coal where the fire is inside but you can't see it. So this is the world of creation. and then there are certain creations, there's certain angels, but again, God is still revealed in that world to a great extent. The only difference is that the concept of creation has now come about, of creating an external being. But those beings in Bria are completely nullified to God. Next, you have the level of Yetzira, which is translated as the world of formation. But this world, the world of Yetzira, is where now it's already less revealed. God is less revealed and allowing other beings to become more revealed. But again, it's still within the formation, but God allowing Himself to be less revealed in that place.
To back away. He's
Well, backing away wouldn't be the right way because God is there, but the tzimtzum is greater. God's concealment of Himself is greater. And then finally, the lowest one is the world of Asiya, the world of action, and that's the world that we live in, where until it comes out, Asiya Gashmi is the physical action, where it actually plays out the idea of doing something, and doing something where God conceals Himself to the extent that we almost can't see Him at all. Now, another word to add to your vocabulary is the word yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. Over here is translated as ex nihilo, which means something from nothing, but it's really not something from nothing, because it's really, the way we see it is that we are something, right? Because we only know the existence of things, of something, and then you say you come from God, which God is not anything specific. You can't define God. So that's what it means, God is nothing. To God, He's the true existence, and we are the nothing. In other words, the question should be is,
how did nothing come from something?
How did nothing come from something? Because really, the Chassidus looks at it and says, God is the true existence. The question is, how do we exist? Do we really exist? Now, for anybody that came to the What Is course, we talked about this at length. So a little bit beyond the scope of today, but this is the concept that God has a true existence here. How are we able to exist? And so the answer is the Seder Hishtalshalut, the order of chain levels from one level to the next. Okay. So now that we have this, so now we're going to go back to the example that we gave earlier with the child and the father. So we say, yes, everything comes from the original source. The question is, how does it develop until it makes it to this world? And in that, there's a development process. And each neshama has to go through its development. Some neshamas are developed more in the world of Atzilus, some more in the world of Bria, some more in the world of Yetzira, some in the world of Asiya. And based on how your soul is developed, that's how you're going to come out into this world. Just like that child that's essentially coming from the Father, and it's all from the same source and from the same place, and the toenails and the brain is coming from the very same source. How could that be? Because of the development process. So God also made a development process for us. The development process for these souls is how it comes down through these different worlds. Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, how it plays down, each in its own world.
How is that controlled though? I mean, how does that work? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I think I do. How is it decided?
Yeah.
Who arrives here as a tzaddik? Who arrives here at this
I think you're asking two different questions.
How do you know through the world
How do you know who you are?
Well, no, not how, I mean, when it's being formed, who's deciding the formation? I guess that's.
Who's deciding? Well, there are different neshamas that each one has a purpose. You know, part of the concept of Hasidus is that we're not just here for no reason. We didn't just happen to be here. Every single soul has a purpose in this world. Every single soul is here with a divine energy, inspiration, and purpose.
Right.
And so the different souls have a different purpose. Some souls are meant to come down as a toenail, and some souls are meant to come down as a head. It doesn't mean that one is greater than the other. But in order to get about that toenail soul, it needs to go through this process, because if it was to take its first stop on the highway, then it ain't going to make it down the road. So you have certain souls that are the souls of Atzilus, for example, soul of Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, that are able to come down into this world and completely not be affected by this world, because that soul is essentially living a higher being. It's not at all affected by the physical world. Just like the brain is never going to be stepping on the floor. It's just not what the brain does. Doesn't mean that there is no purpose to the feet. There's a purpose to the feet. And certain souls have to come down and be the ones to play out their purpose within the world. You need people who are going to go and work and affect the world in different ways. I'll give you an example. In our generation, of course, we know that the soul of Atzilus is the Rebbe, who was the tzaddik of our generation. And he would inspire. We've read many stories of people who inspired in different ways. So there was one individual he wanted to know if in general the Rebbe didn't encourage people to go to college because it could have a negative influence. There's one individual who was in college and he wanted to go to yeshiva. And the Rebbe said you should go to college and finish your degree, because if you have a PhD after your name, you will be able to influence people in ways that a rabbi could never influence them, because you have a PhD after your name. So you could say, isn't it better to be a rabbi? Not necessarily. It's good to be a rabbi, but that there are things that people that are not a rabbi could accomplish that a rabbi can't. And so different neshamas, different souls have different purposes, but in order for them to play that out, they have to each go down their chain in order to be the very existence of who they are.
But her question was, what determines the purpose and what determines the chain? For each individual.
We don't. Your question is why? Why? Who?
Yeah.
God determines that.
Okay,
We don't.
Yeah.
God determines that. Yeah, we can't. We
The
can.
analogy is the brain.
Right.
We can't know why we were created the way we were. We just have to understand who we were created to be.
Okay, so basically.
Why was our soul
already-
chosen for that? We don't know that.
So basically, you've been but there it is again. We're talking about being determined. It's already been determined.
Yeah.
Somebody gave us that to give to you from
Yeah.
Michigan, so that's
Okay.
luck.
Wow.
Thank you.
So that's just it. It's what you've been. It's your
See,
determination.
Three
is
times
there.
high for you.
Hashem just sent an angel.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're heading back
You-
to the airport now, but
All right.
we'll see you again.
Now you can come every day.
Okay.
Thank you. Enjoy. Have a safe trip.
Okay.
Just to add a little bit of what was said, getting back into Torah, in Genesis, Hashem says, let us make man.
Let us make man.
Do you think the angels have a role in that too? Because that, I believe that's who Hashem was speaking about.
The answer of the us means God's spiritual makeup of these different realms that we're talking about. This actually helps define that. It's not necessarily angels.
I hear another commentary that when he said we, talking about all of us, because the creation is not complete.
True.
Everything is
Man helps God with creation. That's exactly. That's why we read every Friday night, Vayichulo Shemayim v'aretz, and God and God finished making the heavens and earth. When we recite that on Friday nights, it's like we become partners with God because we're helping God complete that which God has done. And again, this goes back to the point that when we're comparing it to a foot or a hand or a head, it's not that one is better than the other in its purpose. It's just that needs to be part of the makeup. Just like a human being, the foot is needed just as much as the brain is.
Right. So how do we
But-
use this word?
But we don't know why each of us ended up where we were. But for some reason, Hashem puts each and every neshama, each and every nefesh into its place in the world, in its time, and each one has its purpose. And we're reading now in the Torah about the story of the Jewish people entering the land of Israel, and God said, "You, the people that left Egypt, that generation, they're not fit to go into the land of Israel. I gave you a chance, but you show that you're not fit to go into the land of Israel." And so God said, we have to wait 40 years till that entire generation dies out. And you say, if they're such a holy generation, they saw these great miracles, why couldn't they be the ones to go into the land of Israel? Because God needed ones who could more relate to the land than they can. Their souls were not ready to relate to the land. And the soul of Moshe was also not ready for it. He needed Joshua, he needed Yeshua. So when we talk about higher or lower, it's not better or worse. It's just a way of identifying different levels. And so now we've already gone over time. But the problem is that if we're going to stop here and then come back 3 weeks from now and say, by the way, this is what I said 3 weeks ago, so let's try and read this inside. I think we explained it quite a bit. By the soul descending degree I'm in page 58 in this book. 60 in that book. So by the soul's descending degree by degree through his shtalshalut. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. It actually begins the previous page. Exactly so as it were, in the case with regard to every nefesh, ruach, and neshama, in the community of Israel and High. By the soul's descending degree by degree through the shtalshalut of the worlds of Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiyah from God's wisdom. As it is written, you have made them all with wisdom, with chachma, right? Like we said earlier, you made kulam bechachma asisa. We say that in our prayers, kulam bechachma asisa. It all comes from wisdom, which means that it all originates in God's wisdom. Through the descent, the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the ignorant and least worthy come into being. Nevertheless, notwithstanding the fact that they have already become souls of lower levels, the souls of the ignorant and the least worthy, these lesser souls, remain bound and united with the wonderful and mighty unity with their original essence, namely the extension of Chachma Ilah, the supernal wisdom. For the nature of life of the Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama of the ignorant are drawn from the Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama of the righteous and the sages, the heads of Israel in their generation. This is very important. We said earlier that where does the energy of the nails come from? It comes from the brain. And so we say, even when you come down into this world, the ignorant and the simple of the Jews, even though your soul came much lower, you still have to connect to the higher souls of your generation. And this explains the comment of our sages on the verse, and cleave unto him, concerning that which question arises, can a mortal man cleave to God? The answer, our sages comment, he who cleaves unto Torah scholar is deemed by Torah to have the actual become attached to the Shekhinah, the divine presence. Why? For through attachment to the scholars, the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the ignorant are bound up and united with the original essence and their root in supernal wisdom, and thereby with God himself, since he and his wisdom are one, and he is the knowledge. This gives an answer to a question that everybody asks many, many times, especially in Chabad, which is, why do you have to have a Rebbe? Why can't you just connect to God directly? Just pray to God directly. And the answer is, you could pray to God directly, but your soul is, in a spiritual sense, missing that open connection to God, even though it's in the source, it comes from God, and every soul in its source comes from God. But because of this Seder Ishtalshalut, because of this transmission through the different worlds, so we've become a little bit more distant in that sense. And so the way to do that is just like the fingernails connect to the Father through the brain. The same thing, we have an easier time to connect to Hashem through the brain, so to speak, of each generation, which those are the great tzaddikim and leaders of every generation. In the generation of Moses, they had to connect to Moses in order to connect to God. Moses was the soul of Atzilos, of his generation, and so they needed that to connect to God. In the next generation it was of Joshua, and the generation of the story of Mordechai and Purim. They had to have Mordechai to connect to something higher, because again, it's all a makeup of one body, but there are different levels within the body, and so you'll have an easier time connecting to Hashem if you do it through the heads of those generations. So what if someone says, I don't want to? What if someone says, I want to connect to God directly? So it's like saying, what if the toenail says that I want to connect directly to the Father? So could the toenail have that connection? Not without the brain. It's not going to happen. So you do have people who literally despise the tzaddikim in generations. Yeah, in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, you had a group, Dasan and Aviram, Korach, for example. They openly despised Moses. So how do they exist? You could say, first of all, they had trouble existing. But still, where does their connection to God come from? You have certain people who openly defied things that the Rebbe wanted to do. For example, people who came out against the campaign to put on tefillin. People who came out against the campaign of mezuzah. Almost every campaign, there were people that opposed these things. So he's going to say now that these people, they still receive their connection to God through the tzaddik, but it's in a way that they don't see it. It's in a backdoor sort of way. In other words, they think that it's not coming from the tzaddik, but ultimately it is. And so that's why we need to connect to a tzaddik, because they are like the brains in the generation compared to the toenails. Let's continue reading inside. For those who willfully sin and rebel against the Torah sages, how do they receive their spiritual nurture and life? Spiritual life and nurture flow only where there is a desire to nurture and give life. The answer to this, the text continues, the nurture of their nefesh, ruach, and neshama comes from a hind part, a behind, as it were, of the nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the scholar. So that connection is still there, but it's from a behind way. I want to say that I would stop here. The next part is it's on topic, but it gets a little bit off when we're already over time. But let's just make clear the point that we have here, and that is that we gave the example of the child that comes from the brain, and that has to, and the way that you could have different levels from the very same drop from the father is through the 9 months of the mother. Once that child is developed and created, even the toenails still are connected to the brain. The same thing is with our souls. You ask, how can there be many different levels of neshamas? if we all have the same source? The answer is yes, we do have the same source, but it develops in different ways through going through the Seder Hishtalshalut, the order of chains of the worlds. You have different souls that come out in different ways. Some souls that are souls of Atzilus. You have some souls that are souls of Bria, of Yitzira, of Asiya. Most people are souls of Yitzira, but nevertheless, those souls that are the toenail souls, let's just call them, they still always have to have a connection to the brain, and that means that you have to be connected to the souls of the tzaddikim, of the righteous, the holy people that are the souls of Atzilos in every generation, the higher souls, and that helps you connect to Hashem. And even those that don't want to, nevertheless, it's going to happen. And the last part, which we'll have to do next time, he's going to address another question, which is, how can it be that you could have a tzaddik that will be born to parents that seem to be Russia, seem to be negative, not good parents, or vice versa? You could have very good parents that could sometimes have a child that's not good. How could you have, out of the great tzaddikim, you have the son of Yitzchak was Esav. How can it be such a thing?